All right. Lenny. I don't know.
We should do dinner.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
It's been a long time.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. How you doing?
Thank you all for joining us today. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, good. So you will have to pardon some of our audio and physical technicalities this morning. We are trial running the new City Hall for the next 6 months. So thank you all for being here to take part in this with us. So welcome. Welcome to our first ever community conversation regarding affordable housing in the city of St. Petersburg. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brandy Gabbard, and I'll be your facilitator today for this important roundtable discussion. I'm a council member here in St. Petersburg, but I'm also a real estate broker and a housing advocate. I have over a decade of experience advocating for issues such as home ownership, flood insurance reform, transportation, and the long-term sustainability of our communities. The purpose of today's meeting is simply to bring together a diverse range of voices from across the city and the state to discuss one of the biggest issues facing our country, affordable and workforce housing. This is not a crisis that is unique to St. Petersburg. However, it's my personal opinion that the solutions should be unique. They should be as unique as the residents that we are striving to serve, and as unique as the stakeholders who are enacting and dealing with the policies, regulations, and solutions that are being put into action. Across the city, there are organized groups in closed rooms that have been having these same conversations for decades. Ken and I were just talking about that this morning. So one of our goals today is to bring all of those groups together, bring them all to the table, to share their ideas and solutions that they have come up with. But another important goal is to be honest about what is working, what is not working, and what we should all be focusing on going forward to make the biggest and most impactful change to the future of our city. So at this time, I want to introduce my co-hosts for today's event, Representative Ben Diamond and Senator Darrell Roussan. I want to thank both of them for being open to today's conversation, and so I'll just quickly give you a short intro for both of them. State Representative Ben Diamond represents District 68 in the Florida House of Representatives. He was elected in 2016 and then re-elected in 2018. He was born and raised in Pinellas County, and Ben has dedicated his career to service to our community and our state. He practices law in downtown St. Petersburg, where he's been an active civic leader. In the Florida House, Ben was recently elected by his colleagues to serve as leader designate for the House Democratic Caucus. And he serves on the House Appropriations Committee and is the Democratic ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. Help me welcome Representative Ben Diamond. Senator Darrell Roussan is a local attorney with Rubenstein Law in St. Pete. The senator is a political activist and a Democratic member of the Florida Senate representing District 19. Senator Roussan's activism in the community and his law practice often involve his passion for civil rights and fighting drug addiction. Please welcome Senator Roussan. So we're going to take a break in the introductions of the panel to go ahead and hear just a little bit from Representative Diamond and Senator Roussan. So if I could just ask both of you to share a little bit of your experience regarding housing issues in Tallahassee and what your opinion of how our state government has handled these issues, the housing affordability issues over the recent years, and what do you see as the state's role in dealing with this problem to be more supportive of efforts to develop affordable housing locally? And Senator Roussan, or whichever one wants to start.
Okay. Well, I'll start, and I want to start by thanking you, Councilwoman Gabbard, for convening us and for your leadership on this issue. You know, it is so terrific to have somebody with your background and understanding of the challenges and opportunities that we have as a community with regard to affordable housing on City Council. And I mean that sincerely, and I want to also welcome and thank everybody who came today, everybody on our panel. I see some other council members here, Council Member Lisa Wheeler-Bowman in the back, and our council chair, Charlie Burgess, is here. And, yeah, these are just awesome public servants that have been in the trenches for years trying to work on this issue, and it's a hard issue. I have a lot of comments. I think I'm going to sort of reserve most of them and try to listen today and learn. I'll tell you from the state perspective, as you mentioned in the introduction, you know, I was just only recently elected to the legislature in 2016. You know, we have a history, and it's not a good history in the Florida legislature, of taking money that has been dedicated to address this issue and using it for other purposes or priorities. And I don't want to be up here and say that money is the solution, but it's obviously part of the solution. And we have dedicated trust funds in state government. The Sadowski Fund, established by our former legislator, Carl Nurse, who knows a tremendous about this, who used to work as a staffer in the legislature. And for years we've swept those funds for other purposes. This past year, we partially swept the fund. And so you can look at it as a glass half full, glass half empty type situation. You know, the legislature didn't entirely sweep the fund, which we've done in many years running. I think if you add up a decade of the sweeps, you get somewhere over $2 billion of state funds that should have gone to help with affordable housing. And that number is a little misleading because for every dollar of public investment, there's several dollars of private investment associated with that, right? So anyway, I try to look at what happened this past year in the legislature from a glass half full perspective, in that I think for the first time, my colleagues in the Florida House, and all that Senator Rouson speak for the Senate, recognize that our communities are in need of assistance on this issue. And while there is tremendous leadership in local government, we have a role to play from the state. And so I hope that we can do more. There is a bill that I am a big supporter of that basically has said that we are going to actually make the money dedicated for affordable housing in our state trust funds make it legally impermissible for the legislature to grab it and sweep it for other priorities. And that bill was heard last session in the Senate and passed one of the Senate committees, and it's a bipartisan bill. It was sponsored by one of the members of the Senate who's in the leadership track, who's a Republican and a Democratic member of the State House. So I think there's emerging consensus that more needs to be done on the state level. In our community, I think we really do have a perfect storm of challenges here, and I hope we get into a discussion about it. I mean, we have generally lower income or lower wages than most similarly situated metropolitan areas, and we have higher prices for either homes to buy or higher rent. And it really is the perfect storm, and it's going to require us to work through that from local government, from state government, and then neighborhood by neighborhood. I hope we get into some discussion about how we can start coming together as a community and recognizing that this is in everybody's best interest for us to be proactive in working through these issues together. And this is about helping each other and helping our neighbors and helping working people, and that we can do that while maintaining and improving upon the character of our neighborhoods and our community. So look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Good morning. And I echo many of the sentiments of Representative Diamond. And by the way, he's been a great member in the House and a great member to work with on issues, and I appreciate your support and your insight whenever I've come to you. Home ownership remains an important part of the American dream. Yet it's that important part of the American dream that is still lagging. 30 years ago, 1987, 30% of first-time homeowners were purchasers in this community. Some 30 years later, that 30% has only increased to 34% in 30 years, first-time homeowners entering the market. We've got a lot of work to do. The legislature, as Representative Diamond says, has not done a good job maintaining its role and its partnership with local government on solving this issue. One of the things I intend to work on is to work more closely with the Schimberg Center for Housing at the University of Florida, which was created, by the way, by the legislature some 6-7 years ago to help advise local governments and to be a data bank of information that could be used towards solutions on these problems, and they've been underutilized. Hopefully not underfunded, but underutilized, and I intend to work more closely with them. But I bring a regional perspective to this issue as the only one of 7 senators in Tampa Bay that represents both downtowns. What's happening in downtown St. Petersburg is happening in downtown Tampa. What happens with these unaffordable apartment units going up for the average working person is happening in downtown Tampa. We've seen that hospitals, corporations, small businesses all want their employees to really work, play, and live in the same area. Yet they cannot, they're priced out of the market. I know that City of St. Pete, I think it's City Code 17.5, has an affordable housing bonus program, but it doesn't lead to more market rate apartments. This year the legislature tried to further hamstring local government by sticking an amendment in a bill in the last few days that said if local government requires or mandates affordable housing by a developer, then the local government must incentivize or pay that developer for that. That's a chilling factor. And there's a lot of work to do. I'm very proud of the developments that are going on in St. Petersburg and in downtown Tampa, but they also affect Riverview, which I represent, Apollo Beach, which I represent, Brandon, which I represent. And what happens here affects there. One issue that I hope comes up today is transit-oriented housing. To what extent are we encouraging market and affordable housing units to be built with transportation in mind? So those are some of my comments. Ever since I served on Tax and Budget Reform Commission, I've had to fight to not allow the raiding of the Sadowski Trust Fund. In fact, I was quoted many times as saying if it's truly a trust fund that should be used for housing, then it ought to be used for that purpose. Other than that, we need to change the name and call it a maybe fund. Hurricane Michael is reason enough that we should not have diverted housing dollars to any other purpose than to restore housing. So I look forward to the discussion this morning, and thank you for the invitation, Councilwoman Gabbard.
Thank you both so much for being here, and thank you for your leadership. We are very fortunate to have you representing us in Tallahassee, so thank you both. So now I have the very daunting task of trying to sum up the experience and phenomenal leadership of the rest of this panel. I'm going to try to do it as quickly as possible because if I told you all the great things about all of them, we'd be here all day. So I'm going to go ahead and start by just quickly introducing all of them with just a little bit about each of them. Starting here next to Senator Rouson, we have Ken Rush. Ken is with us today on behalf of Habitat for Humanity of Pinellas, where he has worked for 13 years. In his current position as Chief Operations Officer, he oversees the restore operations, property acquisition, insurance and compliance, and works with the Neighborhood Revitalization Program here in St. Pete and throughout the county. Welcome you, Ken. If you guys want to go ahead and clap after each one to welcome them, you're welcome to. Carl Nurse, former council Councilman Nurse served for over a decade on the St. Petersburg City Council representing District 6. He is a longtime advocate of significant zoning and regulatory changes to spur the rehab and construction of affordable housing. He has a leadership role in 4 affordable housing nonprofits, but today he is joining us in his role as the current chair of the Grow Smarter Housing Work Group. Welcome. Next we have Scott McDonald. Scott McDonald is joining us today as the chair of the newly formed, as of 2018, St. Petersburg Housing Policy Group. He is the executive vice president and CFO for Blue Sky Communities, a developer of workforce housing across the state of Florida. He is responsible in that role for all of the project finance needs and closing transactions for the company. Welcome, Scott. Brother John Muhammad. He is the St. Petersburg Regional Director for Organized Florida and lead organizer of the New Deal for St. Pete. His work includes development of a community-led agenda that was formed after surveying several hundred residents in St. Petersburg about points of progress that they would like to see in the community. Next, on the right side, we have Joe Farrell. He is the Director of Government Affairs for the Pinellas Realtor Organization, representing over 9,000 real estate professionals in Pinellas, Pasco, and Hernando counties. He advocates for homeowners, homeownership affordability, education, economic development, and transit. Welcome, Joe. Reverend Watson Haynes. He is the President and CEO of the Pinellas County Urban League. He is a popular public speaker, consultant, and trainer in governmental and nonprofit organizations and education. He has served as the Education and Community Outreach Project Coordinator of Academic and Student Affairs at St. Petersburg College. He has held various gubernatorial appointments over several administrations and is a true community advocate, including his work as an associate minister at Bethel Metropolitan Baptist Church. Welcome, Reverend Haynes. And to bring us full circle, we have Ben Toro-Spears. He is a technical advisor for the Florida Housing Coalition, a statewide affordable housing advocacy and technical assistance nonprofit. Ben works with service providers, developers, government agencies, and regional planning bodies to preserve and promote access to affordable housing. Before working for the coalition, he worked for the Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national community development intermediary. Ben lives and works in St. Petersburg, Florida. Welcome, Ben. All right, so now that we got all the formalities out of the way, let's get started on the important part. I'm going to start out for the first little bit with kind of directing a question to each one of our panelists. So we can kind of get a feel for their area of expertise, but also kind of their viewpoints on particular issues. And then we'll go into the community question portion. So please hold your questions until we go through all of the kind of pre-scripted questions, if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with Ben, our guest from the Housing Coalition. So Representative Diamond kind of started out this conversation about the Sadowski Fund. And so I would like to hear a little bit from you regarding your perspective from the state level, not only on the Sadowski Fund, but kind of this idea of using public funds to pay for affordable housing overall.
Sure thing. Yeah, really appreciate it. And before I get started, I just want to say I really appreciate the number of folks in this room on a Tuesday morning at 10. It really demonstrates the support for this important issue. So thank you all, really. So I work for the Florida Housing Coalition, and I would say many people consider us an advocacy organization in Tallahassee. We are, in many circles, best known for advocating for full funding of the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund. So I think that's why we've been identified for this first question to talk specifically about Sadowski. I will take just a couple seconds to mention that we do other things.
Please do.
In fact, a majority of our staff hours are spent on in the ground in cities and counties around the state, exclusively Florida. We do not go beyond Florida. And we work with nonprofit developers, for-profit developers. We work with service providers that are working to end homelessness. We work on shared equity models, like the community land trust is the primary vehicle for it. We work on inclusionary zoning from a policy perspective. So we are on the ground doing this every day, and we've been doing it since 1982. All right, so outside of all of that kind of spiel about who we are, the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund is a gem. It is a jewel. When we go around nationally, there are housing coalition conferences, right? We show up and we hear from folks out in the Dakotas or in Minnesota or wherever it may be, and they say, well, we just spent the last 3 years fighting for $50 million, some state bond or something, and we won. We got the $50 million, and they're proud of that. And then we go up there to the front of the room and we say, well, last year over $300 million in revenue for affordable housing was generated in the state of Florida. And that's year after year after year. Not that number specifically, but it is a true gem nationally, and we should be proud of that. It is an excellent thing. It really helps us out. So every year, the Florida Housing Coalition is advocating for full funding of the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund. And believe it or not, it's hard making that argument in some circles. We sit down in a legislator's office and they say, well, how much of the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund do you want this year? We want 100%.
Wow.
Wow. So what is particularly frustrating in this environment is that the Florida Housing Coalition operates what is called the Sadowski Coalition. The coalition is a group of like-minded organizations that support full funding of Sadowski Housing Trust Fund. Full funding. And it is a broad cross-spectrum of organizations. The Florida Bankers Association, AARP of Florida, the Florida Realtors are a fantastic support. Florida Association of Counties, it goes on. Dozens of organizations that recognize the importance of affordable housing and pursue it, okay? So there is a strong argument to be made that we need full funding. We are in a housing crisis. The problem is, year after year, the legislature keeps sweeping. So over $100 million last year was swept and allocated to hurricane-impacted communities. We need that housing funding everywhere in the state. I think from our perspective, one of the biggest concerns is that this is becoming normalized. Rather than in years past, they would say, well, we have a particular need this year, and so for that reason we have to sweep. That conversation is becoming less and less, to the point where it is seen more as a piggy bank by leadership. And we cannot let this become normalized. This is not normal activity. We are in an active housing crisis now. So that's all negative. I just want to, before ending, I just want to say that the folks on this, in this panel, our elected representatives are absolutely advocates. You folks are fighting the good fight here. So if you are a constituent of the folks on this panel, you can know that they are strong advocates for full funding of Sadowski. You did mention public subsidy as a form of supporting affordable housing. So let me talk about that very quickly. There are too many smart people on this panel for me to just keep talking. One of the strongest strengths of the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund is that it is, yes, public subsidy, but it is incredibly efficient, it is incredibly effective, and one of the side effects of annual funding is that there are professionals in cities and counties across the state who know how to bring in money and put those dollars out to good projects. That is surprisingly difficult. Housing can be a very complicated issue. And when you have professionals who know the program and they know how to get the money out the door, that's really important. particularly when there's a natural disaster, right? Up in the Panhandle, Congress at the federal level appropriated millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars, and those dollars are now on the doorstep of cities and counties in the Panhandle. And they're sitting on, we were working with Panama City the other day, and they're looking at $30 million that they need to get out next year, right? That's a lot of money, and the only way it's possible is through this infrastructure of housing that is supported by Sadowski year after year. So I would just say, this is public subsidy, absolutely, but it is supporting really effective and efficient housing support across the state. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I just wanted to kind of follow up. So you talk about the Sadowski Fund, and Representative Diamond talked about the idea of going back now and making sure that that's protected in state statutes. So here in the city of St. Petersburg, we're talking about really doing the same. We're talking about setting up a dedicated fund and possibly putting before the voters a referendum to protect it in charter. So, Joe, I kind of wanted to throw this one to you and ask you if you could talk a little bit about the idea of this protected fund and, as Councilman Gertis actually coined it, the lockbox, if you will.
The lockbox. As Ben Toro Spears mentioned, our state association goes to Tallahassee every year asking for the money that we, along with Florida Home Builders, Florida Housing Coalition, and other groups in the late 80s, came together and convinced the legislature to create. We're basically asking for our own money back. And it's a tax upon our own industry, it's a tax upon homeowners. We just, as a group, they basically looked at it and said, look, we need to be part of the solution even if we have to pay a little bit towards it. And that's frustrating. And especially when every year we go to Tallahassee, and we have about 185,000 realtors across the state. They've got myriad issues that we have to go and coalesce down to 4 or 5 issues that every year are one of our top 5 issues, it's always in the top 5, is not rating Sadowski. If you think about that from a business standpoint, if we could just fix that, take that off, we could work on so many other things. The city of St. Petersburg is seriously looking at affordable housing issues and realizing that one of the most important things, as Representative Diamond said, not the only thing, but one of the most important things is money. Is we have full faith in the current city council administration to fully fund whatever new tax or funding streams they would have for affordable housing in the future. Just like we did with the legislators back in the late 80s. What we don't have faith in is people we don't know. We don't know who's going to be in charge in 5, 10, 15 years from now. And they're going to have the same issue that our current legislature has. I don't believe there's any legislators in the state legislature now that were there when the Sadowski Fund wasn't swept, at least partially. I could be wrong. Maybe there's 1 or 2. You lose it. You lose folks who remember why something was created. So we would like to put in a charter something as simple as saying any funds that are raised for or any funds that are appropriated for housing, affordable housing issues, must be spent on those issues. It's that simple. And the reasoning against that is that an emergency may come up, that the money may need to be used for something else. There's always going to be an emergency. The legislature has had hurricanes. The excuses we've heard over the last years are very important excuses in Tallahassee. We've had hurricanes like Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Charlie, things like recessions. The unfortunate situation happened at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, and all the funding they had to go to school hardening and everything like that afterwards. There's always going to be a need. If housing is always put on the back burner, that need is going to grow to a point where we're coming in most of the state of Florida, and it's coming in St. Petersburg, and we're fixing one need and creating another one somewhere else. So that is the most important reason why. But it also gives confidence to the people that are paying that tax, the tax is being used properly. Another issue we want to kind of solve, or at least try to move the needle on a little bit, is the stigma of the term affordable housing, which permeates our society. So we believe that, that's not my idea, they all believe it too. But the important part of that is if we start to move that way, we'd have more people involved. We'd actually need a room bigger than this to help solve the problem. And that's a big way we want to get people confident in the process of what affordable housing means and what it's going to do. So we believe this can really give a lot of folks, a lot of important voices in this conversation, a little more comfort to be part of the team.
Thank you. So I want to continue down the path of talking about funding, and I kind of wanted to maybe bring Scott into the conversation. As many of you may know, the city has embarked on a study that would actually look at the nexus of a linkage fee to be charged potentially on commercial and residential development to pay for the creation of affordable housing. So Scott, from the policy group point of view, and also by putting on your developer hat, if you could talk a little bit about what fees like that could mean for us as a community and the pros and cons of that.
Sure, thank you. You know, most of all, I'm encouraged that we are talking about this topic, both with the frequency and the manpower that's behind it now, and I think that's a huge first step for our city. The next steps that we have to address are nobody wants it built near them, and nobody wants to pay for it. And Joe touched on that a little bit. So I think you know, every development that we do is really a public-private partnership, and that's not just public at the local level or the federal level. It's funding from the federal government, it's funding from the state, it's funding from the local government. And when all three of those are working together, that's how we start to make a dent in the affordable housing crisis that we have before us right now. We, at the policy group level, are extremely encouraged that City Council is talking real seriously about tackling this. You know, I guess about a month ago at Community of the Whole, there was a lot of talk about the mechanism, and I think, you know, not to beat it more, but what we've learned at the state level is if you set aside the funding, that's great. If it can be swept, we have not really tackled the problem. So they talked at length about making that a lockbox, and I applaud them for that. And there is another committee to hold this week on affordable housing on Thursday. Would encourage everybody to come. So the next thing to tackle is how do we fund that? And as Councilwoman said, there is a study going on with regards to a linkage fee and how that would fund the fund that the City Council has created. I think it's important to understand both, you know, that we have a crisis, but also what's it going to take to put a dent in that. I think from where I sit, I think the city really needs to look at somewhere in the range of $3 to $4 million per year going into that fund. And it remains to be seen when the study comes back how much we think that the linkage fee may contribute to that. But I think it's really important that everyone here realize there's no silver bullet to this. It is going to take a concerted effort on all fronts, from zoning and parking and federal funding and state funding and local funding. So, and that local funding may need to come from an array of different sources. So I think I'm anxious to see the study when it comes back, and I want to thank Councilwoman Gabbard for creating our council. It's been a great experience, both hearing what the members of the community have to say, discussing with staff, and sending what we believe are the important issues to City Council to continue to discuss. So I thank you for having me and look forward to the discussion.
So before we finalize the funding piece, I kind of wanted to switch over to Ken and have you talk a little bit about the cost of affordable housing, about the rise in construction costs, land costs, and the minimal availability of subsidies.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I don't think it's any secret to anybody here in this room that land, real estate, Joe would know for sure, the numbers have gone up and up and up. And unfortunately, the wages around the county and the state have not gone up with the same increase. I can reflect back years ago when we were picking up property, and Carl would allude to this, for pennies on a dollar. Of course, it was where the location of the property was, but I don't have to go back very far to tell you that on the north side of St. Pete, property was readily available as well. Those days are over. The investors have come in, they've cleared out everything that had any attainable value so that they can either flip or decide to develop it on their own. What we're faced with now is the property that is out there is so encumbered by liens and problems and title issues, they're just not there anymore. So it makes it a tough road for us whenever we think about how are we going to develop this property. Add to that the cost of construction, which construction's phenomenal. I'm a resident of St. Petersburg, proud to say. I drive downtown, I went to the Rays game and walked around a little bit, and it's just amazing how much construction is actually taking place. And that's good for all of us. Maybe. Maybe. It brings jobs, hopefully, local jobs to the area. It brings excitement, it brings rejuvenation, but where's it really happening at? It's wonderful to go and walk Central Avenue, and I can tell you it's certainly different than what it was when I moved here 25 years ago. But when I go out into the communities, the people that really need it the most, there's really not a whole lot going on, and yet we're paying a premium for what construction is happening there. You take all of these influxes, if you will, and you put a grand total to the end of it, and I think there was a report done, and Carl was actually looking into it, that the average house cost, I think about a year ago, was $300,000, $400,000 in the city of St. Petersburg for a single-family residence. We're blessed to have a 0% interest that keeps housing affordable at Habitat, but the reality of it, our prices have increased to $200,000, $190,000, an area where that was just never the norm. So it's happening across the spectrum. It's happening to everybody, and it's affecting every one of us. You can combat that with funding. Obviously, funding is needed. There's no question around that. But to Scott's point, it has to take this community to understand the need in order for us to make a difference. It's not just funding. It's not just the allocation of lots or the debt forgiveness that some of the municipalities have or programs that they have to help wipe away some of the liens and encumbrances. But it's a community understanding the need for each and every one of us to have a decent place to live. So cost, it's hard to put a price on it, quite frankly. It's really up there, and it comes in so many different forms and fashions. What I consider to be an exuberant cost may be something that someone else doesn't even fathom. And for that person, what little bit may seem like such a great number to them. So it's such a widespread problem that we have across this county, across the state, across the country, unfortunately.
Well, in addition to the funding conversation, one of the things that we know is changes to zoning can be very powerful to help accomplish. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit with Carl. Carl, as I mentioned earlier in his bio, has been an advocate for zoning and rezoning and redevelopment for a long time. So Carl, can you talk a little bit about changes that we could make or things that we are currently doing that would promote the construction of accessory dwelling units, duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings in our traditional neighborhoods?
Hopefully in about a month or so, we'll have what I would call phase one of relief, which will allow accessory dwelling units on smaller traditional lots, which would allow the potential of those units being built in about 10,000 more locations. St. Pete essentially outlawed accessory dwelling units about 40 years ago. And about 10 years ago, we cracked the door open, and about 2 years ago, we nudged it open some more. But to give you an example, Portland, Oregon is building more than 600 of them a year in a community smaller than ours. And you know, we're excited because maybe we might be building 7 or 8% of that right now. So that's the first change. Second thing, frankly, is in the CRA area, only about 10% of the building units are more than single families. In the last decade, we built 32, as far as I can find out, duplexes or triplexes in the city, in the entire city, in a decade. That's frankly what I think we ought to do is to just accept the fact that why don't we let this in the CRA where we have 60% of the vacant lots, why don't we go back to the zoning that we had 40 years ago and allow the construction of duplexes and tris and small apartment buildings. Frankly, on the north side of town, the traditional neighborhoods, you've got that sprinkled all in there. And I finally come to the conclusion that there's not a great value in changing the zoning there because there's not very many vacant lots and the land values are so expensive. I'm not sure we're going to get much. But in the CRA, you could build, frankly, a few thousand housing units that would inherently be more affordable. The other thing is we've got to change the zoning on the major corridors so that you create multifamily on those corridors. It doesn't make it, I don't think anybody in their right mind would build, on a 4-lane major street would build a single-family house. But it does make sense to make those live-work places. And so that may happen, the bigger part of the conversation may happen before the year is out. Conversations have been going on for a few years. But it's this. If we take all the vacant lots in town and build single-family homes on them, by the time we're done, we'll be in worse shape than we are today. So the zoning changes have to be part of it, and frankly, where most of the vacant lots are in neighborhoods where you're going to get the least pushback, because there's a desperate need for decent housing in these neighborhoods.
Well, speaking of pushback, I think we've all seen in recent years, and this is not something unique to us, that anytime there is community input into rezoning or new potential developments, there's always a bit of an uproar. I've heard it mentioned a couple of times. So I don't really have anyone specifically to address this question to. Anybody can chime in. What do you all think that we can do to do a better job of helping explain the community benefits of what we're trying to accomplish when we address the housing crisis? Anyone?
I would start by reminding people that this is housing for our parents, in their retirement. It's housing for our children for their first home, and it's. This is the first time I have seen a boom that we are only building for the top 10 or 15%. If you don't build a community, if you don't build a spectrum of housing for your community dies. Yeah. And so I think on a human level, reminding them that it's our parents and our children may help some of the pushback.
I would like to say something about that. I agree. With a lot of these things, they become impersonal and it just becomes policy, and we don't see the impact of the people who are associated with them. And so when you say affordable housing, that evokes an image, but you don't see grandma, you don't see, the 22-year-old daughter who's engaged to be married and is looking for a house. Like, you don't see the people that are impacted by this. And I think really being able to organize the voices of those who are directly impacted. For example, when we have a community conversation, such as the conversation today, how do we define community? And then really being intentional about reaching into the communities that we're specifically talking to and collectively working to solve the issue together so that, for example, we have another one of these conversations at 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock on a Thursday night as opposed to 10 to 12 on a, so the community can actually show up. And so I think humanizing it, having people who are directly impacted to tell their stories and show the multiple faces of those who are impacted by the issue would help in showing the benefits.
And you can never do enough outreach, awareness, and showing people opportunities for the benefits of home ownership. From 2013 to 2017, in Pinellas County, only 36% of African American households were homeowners, compared to 67% of Asians and 69% of whites. So outreach to communities, and all of you who are homeowners currently have seen the value of your house rise and the impact it has on your bottom line just in the last 3 years. So I echo what Brother John is saying, but also we recognize some of the elected officials that walked in to the room. I saw School Board Member Renee Flowers walk in, and School Board Member Lentino here, welcome. But also we have 2 newly appointed members of the St. Pete Housing Authority, and there's room here for discussion about renovation, preservation of public housing, and the role that it plays in the whole component of household sheltering. Terry Lipsey Scott and Stephanie Owens, we support what you're doing, and Jordan Park should never become Laurel Park. And some of you remember that. Yes. When they built the dome, Jack Kemp, the HUD secretary, promised us that public housing called Laurel Park across the street from the dome would never be torn down. Yet it's now a parking lot for the Rays baseball game, and that housing stock was never replaced. So it's important that we continue outreach. It's important that we define the benefits so that people will want to become homeowners. And I think that should be a part of this discussion also.
Reverend Hayes?
I think part of what we've got to recognize is that there's a challenge within our community, especially within the African American minority community, and that is called predatory thieves, who come into the community and say, "I'll buy you a house," and people, they wave a check for $60,000 to somebody, force them to move out of the house. That person goes and rents an apartment for $1,000. In 5 years, that money is gone, but they can't go back to their home because it's been sold for $200,000. I think we've got to deal with those predatory thieves within the community. Also, we've got to encourage people to stay where they are and build where you are and fix your own house and don't have as much distrust of some of the government programs that might be out there to assist you to stay in your house. Because the challenge is, if we don't do that, they'll end up in front of Teresa Jones with the homeless problem. And we've got a significant number of them happening because people have allowed themselves to be used by predatory lenders, by predatory buyers, and people who have no care or concern. It's about the dollar. It's about cash. And they use that in African American communities and get over very well. At some point, we've got to begin to look at how do we message to people to stay where you are, create your own equity, create your own investment, pass that on to your children. That's where we've got to go. And not saying consistently, let's tear it down and build it up. Let's fix it where it is and try to get these people to stay where they are.
Yeah, just to add, and I echo all the comments that have been said on this topic, I think it's a two-pronged approach. It's the outreach that Senator talked about. It's education about what workforce and affordable housing is and especially what it is not. We actually, at the policy group just a few weeks ago, talked about how do we do that outreach as part of our mission, to go out and provide the tools to the neighborhood associations to educate their homeowners that this is what affordable housing is. There's 2 brand new developments in the Kenwood neighborhood that are beautiful. In fact, if you drove by them, you would probably not even know that they were affordable housing. There is absolutely no question in my mind that did not devalue the neighborhood at all. That's the first education. The second is, and I hope everyone here knows this, but I don't want affordable housing in my neighborhood is not actually a valid reason for a jurisdiction to turn down a housing development. So going back to something that Carl said, attacking it from the zoning standpoint, an argument that actually does work is that it's uncharacteristic of the neighborhood and that the zoning doesn't allow for it. If we can attack that from the zoning standpoint, that takes that argument out of everybody's hands.
So there was a lot said said in that. I want to unpack a little bit of it, and one thing that I want to kind of get back to Brother John is, we're having a conversation about how do we get better community buy-in from the residents that we're not trying to serve. How do we get more community buy-in from those who we are looking to serve? You and I have had a conversation before about the community voices, how we better lift them up and kind of help us to understand what you call the difference between the context experts and the content experts.
So with context experts are those who can really shape the discussion from the perspective of the lived experience. And a lot of times we have content experts who are subject matter experts who have studied the problem and who have written research papers on the problem, but they have no real connection to the issue. And I think when we talk about having people buy in, we have to acknowledge the fact that people have bought in before and then got robbed of what they bought into. What Reverend Haynes talked about, and also Senator Rouson, acknowledging the fact that there is distrust, and that distrust is rooted in historical practices that have led us to distrust policymakers. So you've made promises that have been broken, and so now we're coming back saying, no, we mean it this time, we're really going to help you, but we need you to buy in. There's a barrier there. And so I think being able to understand that and acknowledge the past while including them in the solutions for the future, and not only bringing those to the table after the cake has been baked, because that's another one of the things that happens too, where community members, and I'll use that term, you can evoke whatever image you think, but community members are brought to the table to get buy-in to a policy that has already been decided, and it's more of just checking a box to say, well, we talked to the community and the community agrees with us, not acknowledging the fact that the community doesn't always agree with the policy.
Right. And I think that gets to the heart of why we're here today.
Absolutely.
Is because, in the city of St. Petersburg, we're looking at baking the cake.
Right.
So for me, it was important, and Representative Diamond and Senator Rouson, we talked about this, it was important to get that community input now before we hand it down and say, this is what we've decided is best for our community.
And we applaud you for that. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming and doing that with us. So I just have one final question that just kind of came up to me as we were having the last conversation. I hear a lot about home ownership. I keep hearing, people mentioning home ownership. For me, I've always felt like it was very important that we are looking at a myriad of solutions and a very wide range of economic need. And so, rental is important, home ownership is important. I would open it up to the panel to discuss kind of the balance. How do we find a balance between the two so that we're making sure that we're properly addressing a wide spectrum of need? Anybody want to talk about kind of their thoughts on that?
I personally think that it's a balance, yes, but I think the need needs to be laid out there for the person to choose. Not everybody's going to be a homeowner. Not everybody wants to be a homeowner, quite frankly. There are a lot of people that love the rental idea. They love the idea of townhouse or condominium because they don't want to mow their grass when it's 97 degrees outside. And I don't blame them. But the reality of it is, as long as we're making an equal opportunity for that person to choose, I think that's the best we can actually offer. There are those that do want home ownership. To them, that's the American dream, the white picket fence in the backyard. And we need to make that available as well. But it's for the individual to choose. And again, it goes back to the education of the community understanding. I wrote down NIMBY here whenever we first sat down, and I never thought I would have an acronym that I would understand so well. The people we serve, quite frankly, if you think about it, I live in an area over by the main library. The people we serve are firefighters and police officers and school teachers and healthcare providers. Well, I can tell you right now, those are the people I want in my neighborhood. So we need to rally around that and understand that these are the people that we're trying to find a solution for, not a class that we really don't want to be a part of.
Anyone else have comments about rental versus home ownership, balance between the two? Carl? I'm sorry.
I mostly work with nonprofits that are either renovating existing housing or building new housing, and it's all affordable housing.
And I got to tell you, it sells on a heartbeat. I mean, there's clearly way more demand for people to buy, to buy the first house than there is supply.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I do understand there's a time of life where people want to rent, but home ownership is the dominant way that somebody actually, at retirement time, essentially has free housing. Except for the maintenance part. And so I think it's a myth that people don't want to own houses anymore. And I experience it every time that, one of the nonprofits finishes building or renovating a house. And if I'm at one of those houses, you cannot go to one of those houses without people stopping you and asking, when is it for sale? How much is it? So there's plenty of demand for people to buy. There just is almost no supply, and and our mission in many respects is how do we open up that supply?
Yeah, and I think also, great point. I think when we talk about the balance has to come in the policy-making aspect of it, as well as the communications to the community, and understanding that if we are renting, more than likely we're paying somebody else's mortgage. And when we talk about, being cost burden for our living expenses and paying, 30, 40, 50% of our income to housing, being able to show how home ownership can bring that cost down, and being able to help people transition out of renting into home ownership. But immediately we go, policymakers have defaulted a lot of times to the home ownership solution, as opposed to saying, what can we do to build a runway and make it easier for renters to be able to save up money for down payments and get into a position where they are able to buy, and having that balanced approach where you acknowledge the full spectrum that includes renters and relief for renters and rent control and the different things that we can do for renters to make it easier to transition into home ownership when they're ready to do so.
Yeah.
Watson, actually, did you?
Yeah, I think we've got to also look at other issues. When we look at elder abuse, we do it for their finances, we do it for their health, but nobody steps in to do what they can to assist an elderly person to stay in their homes. And you further that by code enforcement, writing up so many fines for people that these guys go and they read all the information in code enforcement, go to somebody and say, well, you got all these codes, I can give you a check, and you can go away and the codes will go away. And that's happening in the African-American community. And at some point, we've got to look at what we do to people that we don't realize we're doing to put them in a precarious situation. And that happens in the African-American community, unfortunately.
Representative Diamond?
Well, I mean, there's been so many good points made, and part of what I just wanted to add here is with regard to your question about home ownership versus renting. I mean, and to go back to what Carl said, I mean, these places are selling, and there just aren't many of them. There just isn't supply, and I think part of what we need to be doing is looking at down payment assistance, because you've got a lot of people that are working people, whether they're the teachers or the firefighters, or and they have the income where they can be making the monthly payment. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people now think about this in terms of just this issue is just, well, how much does this cost me per month? And if we could be doing more to help them make that down payment and get into that first house. I mean, from my perspective, in terms of the balance, I think we all generally agree there's no substitute for home ownership in terms of how it changes your perception of your street, your neighborhood, your community. It's a different experience. And I agree with some of the comments earlier. I mean, I don't think people are choosing, for the most part, not to buy. I think they can't afford to buy.
Ken?
Yeah, just real quick. I think that the word balance is important because there is a demonstrated and acute need on the rental side. People simply do not have the capital to afford a down payment. all of the closing costs, it's just out of reach for people, and it's demonstrated by fact, right? So a community like ours absolutely needs to focus on the rental side because the need is there. But at the same time, ownership is also really important. Ownership is freedom. When you are paying money to someone else, it limits your options in life. But the issue with home ownership often is that maybe the initial unit is affordable, so-called, but the next time it's sold, it is no longer affordable because the market has risen. So we need to shortcut that dynamic, and I just want to give a quick shout out to community land trusts as an option. We want to make sure that the community has ownership so that for decades, in perpetuity into the future, those properties remain affordable for today's family, the next family that moves in, and they're still sharing in the equity of that sale. So I think that it really needs to be a balance, but we also need to focus on shared equity models for ownership.
I can take one more if anybody else wants to weigh in on this one, and then we're going to, Joe?
I would say it's no coincidence that, however you break it down, the communities that have the lowest home ownership rate also have the highest generational poverty. And I know I work for the realtors, and they're in the business of selling people's homes and selling homes to people, so we're a little biased on ownership versus rental, but we also do, a lot of our members do rentals and everything. But if there's a common term that's thrown around now about breaking the generational poverty, the American dream, home ownership, is one of the easiest ways to do it. It worked in my family. My parents didn't come from poverty, but they came from tough times. And I was afforded just a lot of benefits that previous generations of my family didn't have. And I think that my dad says it, and my mom echoes it a lot, is being able to own that first home set them on that path. Now they own 4 homes, and 3 of them are rentals. But they are, it sets you on that path of saving money, of creating your own personal wealth, without having to have an investment fund or all these other things, a 401k that your boss may not provide, or anything like that. You can start your own investment and live in it. And that is important for a lot of people. And I personally, in our association and our membership, wish that it permeated more of our society than it does.
All right, well, we're going to conclude now the scripted portion, and we're going to hand it all over to you.
That wasn't that scripted.
Well, I tried not to make it so that's good.
Yeah,
No,
I
none
didn't
of
get
them
no
got it.
feedback.
So we're going to turn it over to all of you and really get into the community conversation. So I just want to give you a couple of tips here. First of all, we are recording this. So we will be able to go back and listen to your thoughts, your ideas, and really have kind of a historical record of this great day. So I just wanted to let you all know that. When you ask your question, if you are able, we did try to find a handheld mic, but that did not work out. I apologize. So when you do want to ask your question, please come up here to the front mic at the podium, state your name, either what neighborhood you live in or what organization you're here representing, and then go ahead and ask your question. You can ask it to the entire panel, or you can focus on 1 or 2. So who wants to get us started? All right. Yeah. All right.
Come on down.
Good morning, Renee. School Board Member Renee Flowers.
Good morning.
Get us started.
First of all, I want to say thank you so very much for convening this very much needed conversation, because when you talk about home ownership, even rentals, it still affects the children that are in Pinellas County schools, because many of those children are homeless when they're residing in apartments or living in cars. I want to just ask a question. One thing I didn't hear, maybe if I came in late, you had already talked about it, and that's the issue with reverse mortgages. Even though I'm not on city council anymore, I've still received a number of phone calls where individuals have entered into the reverse mortgage agreement, not fully understanding it. And then the family finds out about it after their passing, or or when they've been ill and they've had to be, in this case, had to be placed into a home. So I want to hear more dialogue about that. I know when I was with the city, we had very strong discussions about that pro and con, and in some situations it helps, but in other situations it has really taken the property of seniors who've been in their home for a number of years. The other thing I want us just to focus on, or for you to maybe answer, is home ownership is really good, renting is good, but if they don't have a strong economy within our communities, and if they don't have a job, they can't pay rent, they can't buy, they can't lease, they can't own. And so what are your thoughts on that? And then what are your thoughts as it relates to lenders within our communities? We still have a number of banks who are disproportionately putting into place lending practices that do not compensate for African Americans to be able to get a home mortgage, to purchase a home. And so those persons are going out to some of these shady companies that are charging them a high interest rate and then a balloon mortgage on top of that. So I know that's 3 in 1, but if you can help me out there, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, Watson.
Ms. Flowers, thank you. Thank you for adding that to the conversation, because that is one of the national urban league movements, is that the African American communities are being affected dramatically by reverse mortgages. And people are actually knocking on doors in those communities and offering that opportunity. And oftentimes, yes, what happens is if the person dies and they have a child living in the house, the child is told that you got to get this house remortgaged and refinanced, and they can't do it. And so the house is often being sold. And the person and the families don't actually know what to do. We've had a few situations at this urban league where we've had to work with the CDC of Tampa to really work with some families to bring them through that process. It is not an easy process, and it frightens people. And so, yes, that is one of the challenges we have. And it's certainly a challenge with people, once again, preying on elderly people who they're told, don't worry about this mortgage. We're going to give you some money, and you can spend this money and stay as long as you want to, except that you might die in 2 years.
And I can just add, I mean, one of my big takeaways from this discussion is just how much of that predatory practice is going on. And the state of Florida and the state chief financial officer's office, I think has a role to be doing a lot more in terms of financial literacy and helping people understand that when you're approached, with one of these quote-unquote opportunities, it ain't much of an opportunity. And going back to what you were saying, Brother John, about all the, the distrust and the misinformation that's out there, I mean, there's a real role here, from my perspective, for these state programs that are supposed to be doing outreach and education. But I'll just leave it at that, because I see a long line of
I know, yeah. Joe?
Yeah, that is, the abuse of financing and the predatory lending is something that is an issue that goes along with a lot of the non-traditional forms of finance, if you will. And we don't have this issue necessarily in Pinellas County, but this is another issue that the state can look at with PACE loans. There's been they're trying to be here in Pinellas County, but Collier County just got rid of them. Several places in California just got rid of the PACE loans because they tend to go to African American neighborhoods and senior citizen neighborhoods and just go door to door and convince people on these loans with just, not every reverse mortgage or every PACE loan is bad. But if you are not doing it in the proper way, it can become a very dangerous tool for a lot of communities, and that's what we've seen happen. I'm sure there is someone out there, and there are people out there that there's a reverse mortgage that is good for them and it makes sense. But a lot of people are starting to notice it doesn't work for everyone, and a blanket use of it is not a good idea. And I think Representative Diamond hit the nail on the head. I think we need to start following places like California and maybe put a little more teeth on these things and more regulation.
And there was one comment or question that you had about kind of the correlation between jobs and sustainable
just the
housing.
economy, because we still have individuals who are looking for jobs that pay living wages and above.
Right.
You still are not in line nor in a good position to be able to even afford to buy, rent, or lease when apartments are renting from $1,500 to $1,800 for one bedroom.
Right.
It's not within their reach or grasp.
So I'm going to have Ben talk a little bit about the economic development piece.
Yeah, so fundamentally, affordable housing is related to your income that's in the equation, right? So your income matters. It makes a big difference. an issue, I think, in a really broad perspective with affordable housing. There was this earlier question of how do we get more support for affordable housing. I think the issue is that we've been calling it affordable housing, and it's housing. It's housing for people who are earning an income, and this is a low-wage state, right? So we need housing for those people, but I think also we have spent decades and decades and decades siloing affordable housing. We say, oh, it goes over here, it's this kind of high-rise tower, it is something other. I think going forward, it will help our movement if we focus on intentionally creating places that are focused on creating jobs and creating workforce training programs that are also tied to that same housing that those same people, turns out everyone needs to live, right? In some shelter. So just as an example of some of this innovative stuff, the Florida Housing Coalition is developing, in partnership with Fannie Mae, a scalable model for turning vacant commercial space, like an old grocery store, into both affordable housing and workforce development incubator space, and figuring out the financing of that. Thanks. So that we can create a whole community that provides both the housing that's affordable to people and a workforce development job training so that those people can earn a living wage that helps them going forward.
I grew up in Jordan Park. I own my own home. I'll forever fight to make sure that Jordan Park remains standing. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next question. Please introduce yourself and where you live or who you're with.
My name is Alex Mortesas. I've given a few folks on this panel some adjectives, some annoyances, but that's not going to happen today. Okay, I wish Jamie Ross was here, but Ben Torres Spears, it's all on you. First of all, I want to guarantee that me and Renee Flowers did not coordinate what I'm about to say. The federal government gave the Florida Housing Finance Corporation funds to help reverse mortgage people. And that I'm aware of, the Black community in St. Pete was not aware that that was there. And I point to you because, and not you personally, the Florida Housing Coalition is the exclusive Catalyst-funded information provider. All right? So it didn't go out. Okay, let's be honest about that. And the state just killed that. All right? So the second thing is that we talked about the Sadowski Fund, a big circle. And then again, you work with Enterprise, so this will be helpful, right? There is an unlimited source. I mean, if we got all the Sadowski that could happen, and even more than that, and you leverage it 3 to 1, you're basically talking about 300 units a year. But there is an untapped 4% low-income housing tax credit that, again, the Federal Housing Coalition doesn't discuss. I mean, you could literally do $500 million a year just here in Pinellas County, right? So perhaps you can explain why. I know there's someone here with the Blue Sky Assembler Group that might explain it also. You know, why it is, and I know it's difficult, but we have a window with the opportunity zone. So why is it that no one uses the 4%, which would literally uncork the problem?
Yeah, I've been pointed to. I appreciate these questions. I would say that on the 4% side, it is being used, but it is a source of capital for development of affordable housing, and developing affordable housing is very complicated. It can be very tricky, so we want to make sure that folks who are utilizing those resources are doing it in a responsible way. And I think that Scott McDonald, you can certainly speak a little bit more if you'd like to. And it is a resource that's out there. I don't think we have a deep enough bench of developers who are mission-oriented and really focused on developing and expanding the number of
I'm
units.
going to follow up on that because, I mean, I've been a member of a group that does 202 housing, EPA, one of the largest 202 senior housing groups. When you get to a certain size, you go outside your neighborhood, right? I mean, when people look at contracts for big construction jobs, when they look at the databases that are out there, that's why you see people from 2 states over driving in. This is the thing that annoys me, if you will. You know, we have even state laws, you know, we're doing all this lockbox. But state law requires that any excess real estate sold by a municipality be first looked at for affordable housing. But the last sale went to the arts instead of going to affordable housing. So, I mean, I hear we have to be careful, but that to me signals we don't want to use it.
Scott, did you want to?
I would love to.
I think you were addressed, so.
Yeah, I would love to, and I thank you for bringing up a topic that I was hoping to bring up, which is the 4% housing tax credit. It's not unlimited, but for all intents and purposes, it is unlimited.
Well, how is it not unlimited? I mean, you literally don't have to do the 9% lottery. You know, if you borrow on a revenue bond, you can literally self-proclaim the tax credit and use it. So how is it not unlimited?
There's technically a cap at the federal budget level. However, we've never really reached it, so it's, for like I say, in all intents and purposes, it's unlimited. However, the 4% tax credit on its own cannot finance new housing units. It takes, as going back to something I said before, a concerted effort between the 4% tax credit, state level funding, local level funding. So we do a lot of 4% transactions. They typically have somewhere in the range of 3 to 7 million of Sadowski funds in it. However, I believe the number was 2.3 billion that was thrown out. It's not just 2.3 billion. That would then get leveraged 4 times. So the number of units that have gone away because of that it's depressing. It's astounding. But beyond that, it also takes a concerted effort from the community level. So it's still, even with the 4% tax credit, even with Sadowski funds, it is difficult to make the numbers work. That's where the local government comes in, and why I'm excited about what's going on in the city right now, because if we can plug that hole that exists at the city level, then you're making a bigger dent. We're never going to make a dent by just doing 9% tax credit deals in Pinellas County, because Pinellas County only gets 1 a year. So the way to make a dent is for fully funding Sadowski and coming up with a mechanism at the city level.
With all due respect, I'll close out. I was in a HUD regional planning group in Chicago, and that is what I usually hear from someone who is a big developer like Senator Blue Sky, all right? So, you've got a target mix, which doesn't have to do with affordable housing. What I usually hear is we wanted free housing. The 9% tax credit today becomes a free building, as opposed to giving someone a $400 a month rent, which is affordable versus $850. So that's the thing where you and I will just differ on that, because my thought process is the community could use $450 a month rent for teachers and firemen. That's it.
Well, thank you. Next question. Hello.
Morning, I'm Cynthia Lippert,
Hi, Cynthia.
fortunate homeowner in Gateway area of St. Petersburg. Brandy Gabbard is my city council person. Also a member of FAST, a coalition of 40 churches. One of our projects is affordable housing. So a lot of talk about affordable housing. Thank you for this focus on the topic. But can the mayor and city council of St. Petersburg commit that the city-owned Central Avenue old police station property be developed to include housing for people making 60% of AMI or less?
So as the city council person on this panel, I will address that. I can't speak for the mayor. What I can do is speak for myself. And I am very committed to making sure that whatever goes on that property has a very large element of affordable housing, and that it meets a wide spectrum of the AMI that needs. So 60%, absolutely a very large portion of that should go towards the 60%. So that is my personal opinion and commitment for that property, but I'm not the mayor, so I definitely recommend that you reach out to the mayor's office and advocate for the same. All right, thank you. Go ahead.
How you doing? My name is Will Atkins. I'm from Body Park, Southside St. Pete. And I just want to speak on behalf of the black community, the African American community. And I just want to say that, it's funny to me how you can have, because we try not to make it about race, but the reality is it is about race. Because in my community, my mother grew up in Long Park, and I have no history there to go look and see where she played or where she, whatever. And the same thing is happening in my community in Valley Park. So it's crazy to me how you can have two different sets of people looking at the exact same thing and have two totally different perceptions. Which means that these two sets of people must be under two totally different circumstances and two totally sets of stimulus. See, and I want you all to know that there's people in our community that are aware of what's going on, and they don't know about this meeting. So these strategies that I'm speaking on, these circumstances that I'm speaking on, here is an example. Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. My mother's at work, my grandmother's at work, nobody can come here. The people that can't afford these houses you're talking about can't come here because they're working and barely affording to be able to make it until the next month. So I feel like this strategy right here, is a perfect example of what's going on in our community. We're being robbed of our culture. You say that it's affordable housing, but there's no jobs that pay enough. Yeah, there's jobs. Say, oh, well, there is jobs, but these jobs don't pay enough for us to be able to make these decisions that you guys put on us that are so heavy and they're so effective. I'm only 23 years old, but I've been watching this for my entire life. And when I see a white person, I go to their neighborhood, they feel afraid. What are you afraid of? Like Sir right here said, he wants firefighters and he wants doctors and he wants all them in his community. Because you're not afraid of them. Because they're predominantly white. Why are you so afraid of the South Side in the black community? When we don't have a history of kicking y'all out of y'all neighborhood, y'all have a history of kicking us out of our neighborhood. We don't have a history of brutalizing y'all. Y'all have a history of brutalizing us. So just fair conversation, put the politics to the side as human beings. Why is it so unfair that the treatment that's being put on the low wages in income communities, obviously the black community, why is this such a complicated discussion when we ask these questions? Oh, it's complicated. It's complicated. It's not complicated to spend $84 million on the police building. It's not complicated to build these high rises downtown. Why is it so complicated to talk about the fact that we're being bullied? We're being bullied. The statistics show that we have never had a predominant action towards harming your community. So why is this an ongoing thing in our community? That's my question. Why is this such a complicated discussion to have?
Reparations.
Anybody?
I'll say something about Bartlett Park. I mean, what's happening in Bartlett is you really got a vice that's making it
Be
difficult.
respectful, please. Thank you.
Is at the north end, they're calling it Roser Park,
Right.
and there's a for-profit developer that's building, I would say, $400,000 houses that are selling like crazy, but it's obviously pushing people out of the neighborhood. As you get farther south of the neighborhood, you get into the flood zone, and that adds 10 grand or so to the price of building a house. I'm affiliated with a nonprofit that's building a couple of houses, one on 13th Avenue South, and just finished one on 16th Avenue South that they sold for affordable housing. But it's there are and you're seeing a similar experience in Palmetto Park, where for-profit developers are coming in and building dramatically above the current market. Frankly, the city needs to be much more assertive in its foreclosure process. Happily, we've recently changed the foreclosure process in the last maybe 120 days, and so the latest wave of foreclosure lots, are 10 of the 11 went to nonprofit affordable housing folks. And so, because the vast majority of lots that have been sold have been sold to people who are either flipping lots or doing upscale. So those are some of the changes that have to happen.
And I think to your point about what complicates it,
Yeah, thank you.
because
That wasn't what I asked. He didn't.
well, here's the thing.
I completely stumped him.
Well,
You got a 23-year-old convicted felon from the South Side who is college educated, who works for Ruth Chris while I feed most of you while I cook their food for you. And I come here and I ask a question where this is your professional background. This is your professional opinion. And you can't answer my question. But basically, I just told you what you're doing, and then you can't reply because it's the truth.
So I may not answer your question either. It's just something that I want to say. So you just kind of put the expectation real high for me.
Education should be skyrocketing.
But here's what I would say, just from what I'm seeing, the history of racism, the history of what happened nationwide is well documented. What I'm finding when we enter these spaces and try to have these conversations about righting the wrong, there's a segment of the population, and this is kind of a human thing, where we don't understand the difference between responsibility and blame. And so when we start pointing out the wrong about what happened,
responsible for gentrifying.
okay, you're gonna have your time, sir. So here's what and look, I'm with you. I'm trying to help you articulate. I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm sharing my experience with that. So what I'm finding is, again, not being able to separate responsibility from blame. And so when we come, and this is again, nationwide thing, so when we say this happened and it was wrong, the default response is, well, it wasn't my fault. We're not saying it's your fault or anybody's fault, but we are saying that it's your responsibility. And I think when we start to point out the wrong and get others to acknowledge the wrong, the way we present that, I think has a lot of times deals with the human element of the reaction versus a real response. So we'll react, but we don't respond because we don't want to be wrong. And we're saying, look, I understand it was generational. You probably weren't here. It probably was, your family may not have had any connection to that. But you have benefited from what your ancestors have done, and you do have a responsibility to correct it. And I think when we begin to communicate it in that way, when we
So, I'm sorry, one second.
Okay.
We're not here to attack each other.
No, we're not. Yeah.
We're here to have,
This is an attack on the black community, this entire meeting.
Yeah.
if we cannot be respectful, we will call the meeting adjourned. And I don't think anybody wants to do that. So if we can all just be respectful of everyone's time and opinions, I would appreciate it.
And
John, go ahead.
here's what I would say too, because I don't feel attacked, but this issue, and this is what I mean when we say having these conversations with the community. And in the community, it's easy and it's comfortable sometimes to have them in familiar spaces, but when you do have rooms that are filled with people who are directly impacted, it's tough. And it's a hard conversation to have, and so I don't feel that. I understand the passion. I understand where that's coming from because I share it. But again, when we talk about coming to the table and delivering on solutions, there's a way that we can present it because you're a chef and you can cook a great meal, but if you just throw it all on the plate and say, here it is, so there's a presentation that has to happen. And I think the more we begin to understand our audience and say, okay, I'm going to present this in a way that you can have it, and then we can move towards solutions. But when we come and we just throw all the food on the plate and say, here, it's a great steak, that's the problem.
Approach of both sides.
Right.
Both perceptions. It's two people looking at the same thing, and you get completely different perceptions.
Absolutely.
Which means that we're under completely different circumstances, and we come from completely different stimulus.
Right.
Which is why I said what I said.
I agree.
Now, the power behind what I said, it weighs through the people, and they get their reaction, but that does not change what I said.
No doubt.
And
I appreciate
But you make the point in your question when you acknowledge that it is complicated. And it's complicated because of the history. And I feel your pain. I remember the gas plant era. I remember the promises that were made about the housing stock, economic ancillary development when the dome was built. But we must begin somewhere. And this conversation should be expanded, and there should be action that comes as a result of this conversation today. And the state needs to step up and do its part and stop bootstrapping local governments from addressing critical needs in their own communities. So I'm here today to listen to people just like you and hopefully take away from it the things that we as a panel talked about within our areas of expertise. But thank you for taking the time to come here this morning and express yourself.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi, my name is Pat Dunham. I live in Gulfport, Florida, and I just came back from the event on the Washington Mall for Affordable Housing, headed up by Dr. Ben Carson. It was an entirely bipartisan event for 5 days, explaining all the possibilities to help with affordable housing, and they addressed every aspect. I've got my program with me, brought it here today. I sadly didn't even hear about this until I saw it on the news this morning, close to 10 o'clock on Channel 9, so I didn't even know it was going on, so I arrived late. One of the big things this program was pushing is having communities all over the country loosen up their building codes and requirements that stop all this possibility of affordable housing. I mean, most of the laws choke everyone. They can't even do anything on their own property. However, I want to compliment the city of St. Petersburg at least 3 to 4 years ago for allowing accessory dwelling units in backyards. They're the only community here in this area, not Pinellas Park, not Kennett City, not Gulfport, none of them, just St. Petersburg. And they're allowing, and most people don't even know about this. I bet half the audience don't even know this because it's never been publicized, but people can put a tiny house in their own backyard. The requirements are they have to have enough room, of course. It doesn't have to be a big yard, but the thing is that it has to look a little like the house up front. It has to be built on a foundation. It can't be on wheels and hooked up to the house's utilities. So it's a real simple thing. So that's one area that can help so many people. The rents are lower. If the building, if it's a small house, the rent would be lower. Someone could afford it. That teacher, that fireman, the policeman that you're talking about that's looking to rent, they could do that, or whoever. All the other people that are here, and I compliment the young man before me, he did a very nice job. Anyway, there are 2 groups here in town. They are nonprofits, I guess, and they're building a couple of tiny houses, and they're not going to like this, but neither of them contacted anyone in the tiny house community. So I go to a meeting and I'm like, why in the world are you building a 500 square foot house that you're intending to rent out for $1,000 a month, and it's down in the south side of St. Petersburg? So they never even, just so you know who I am, I'm known as the Tiny House Advisor. I travel all over the country and speak at events all over the country about tiny houses, living tiny, and their availability and so forth. So there isn't much that I don't know about it. And speaking about that, people that are thinking of going tiny, whether you're building them or you're going to promote them, the people living in them need to be educated. This isn't just for some poor veteran or someone that has no money. These people don't know how to live tiny. That's a thing in itself. So, it's something that they need to be educated on. So I'm just wanting to say that is an area that I don't know how many of you even know about it, or any of the people in the audience that know that this is something available, and that you can, as a group, reach out to people through the Ben Carson group. He had everybody, you should see the people it was a 5-day event. It was on the National Mall. There were tiny houses there. There were speakers, there were everything.
I can't help it, but did Dr. Carson remember he's Secretary of HUD?
Yes, that may be, but his main thing is helping people be able to live and afford houses. And he was promoting all types of building models. And he wasn't pushing anything having to do with HUD that I noticed. And, any of you would probably have to look at what that program was about. But it was a very helpful program that could help communities all over the country. And St. Petersburg is already one step ahead by allowing the ADUs that could help a lot of people, especially if you let people know about it.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, Jesse?
Hello,
Hello?
my name is Jesse. I live here in St. Petersburg, and there's a lot of people in line behind me, so I'm going to try to make this quick. First of all, I'm very disturbed that you would threaten to shut down this forum. Obviously, affordable housing is a huge problem in this city, especially for the Black community. There's going to be some response if you hold a community conversation about affordable housing. So if the response is not exactly what you want it to be, I don't think you should threaten to shut down the forum. And that just adds insult to injury that you would have, again, as has been said, a community conversation about affordable housing at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday in the Sunshine Center. That's not a community conversation, with the exception of, what was that? Okay, you're out of line, sir. Please be respectful, sir, or they'll shut down the forum. With insult to injury, when you have a forum at which, with the exception of some of the people in here who may be concerned and are concerned, obviously, about affordable housing, this was meant to be an investors forum. That's what this was meant to be today, an investors forum, to plan the face of the South Side by the people on this panel, most of the people on this panel. And I will say, I do blame Carl Nurse, the engineer of the community redevelopment area who owns 4 properties in that land, who stands to benefit from this sham, this insult of an excuse, a pathetic excuse for economic development called the CRA, it should be CRAP, is what it really is, that promises $66 million over 30 years in economic development when you just found $85 million, then another $20 million from Penny for Pinellas to go to a police station when there already existed a police station. And then you talk about, let's say the word that nobody wants to say in here, gentrification. Gentrification is the word that you're all skirting around. And the Black community is being gentrified out of existence. And as a white person in the city, I don't want to be a part of that. I find it sickening. And I know there's been some discussion here about predatory lenders that come in, and it's true. They prey on elderly people, they prey on widows, and Mr. Diamond over here says that, well, the solution to that is to teach those people financial literacy? What the hell? Financial literacy? So that's like telling a woman who's been raped, you need to learn how to, not take that drink from the guy in the bar next time he hands it to you.
Jesse,
And teach her rapist literacy.
Do you
Guys, we're
have
talking
a
about
question
predators who go into the Black community. If you want to stop, don't teach them financial literacy, stop the predators. That's what needs to happen.
Do you have a question for a panelist? Because we have a lot of people behind you and we have 20 minutes.
Yes, I have a question.
Thank you.
How dare you? How dare you hold a forum like this and have this type of phony conversation when in this city, according to the CRA community profile that you assembled in order to further gentrify the Black community, 1 out of 4 residents in the South Side is living on an average household income of $15,000 a year. That's $3,000 less below the poverty line for an individual. That means after the cost of rent, which is 54% average cost of rent for a Black family in the Tampa Bay area, the average person in the South Side is living off $6.30 a day.
That's right.
That is genocide, combined with police containment, combined with gentrification, and high-rise after high-rise after high-rise being built in this city. This is a sham. This is a den of thieves and an investors forum. And there's a protest going on outside this forum. Do you guys know that? There's a protest going on outside. That's the real community conversation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Good morning. My name is David, and I'm a member of the International People's Democratic Reform Movement. And typically when I come up here, I would say that I appreciate this meeting, but I don't appreciate this meeting. Because the Black community, like it's been said, has not been invited to this community, while this whole conversation about affordable housing is about the Black community. You cannot have a conversation about affordable housing and not say black community, John Muhammad. We're not talking about history and anybody's ancestors. We're talking about Carl Nurse, who's sitting right there and is responsible, along with other members of City Council, for there only being one black district in the city of St. Petersburg when there were 3 before. So we're not talking about history, we're talking about where we live right now. I live in the black community of St. Pete, where there's police on the corner every single day. The first thing I see when I walk out of my door is the police. The last thing I see when I go home at night is the police. They stop me in my community, telling me I look suspicious, but they look suspicious because, like the girl said, we don't have a history of attacking the white community. We don't have a history of pushing the white community out. We have a history of being attacked by the white community, and we have a history of the white community pushing us out of our community. So we cannot have this conversation without saying black community. And Ken Rush, we don't want to live in your community, but we don't want you coming into our communities, buying up the property for people who look like you and pushing people who look like me out of it. So for all of these meetings you have, we will be present. And we are here in support of Erica Gile Kenyon, who is running on the platform of Make the Southside Black Again. Because we know you talked about the dome, but nobody said all of those 100 businesses were black businesses. All of those families were black families. So this conversation needs to be put into context. We need to say black community and white community, because in St. Petersburg there are 2 different communities. And there are 2 different sets of circumstances under which we live, and that has to be pointed out. This conversation cannot be had without that context. So I'm offended.
Can I say something on that? So, yeah, Brandy?
Sure.
So, and I appreciate your comments. I think the word that you used is the same word that I used when we said context. So in the context of what I was saying, I think you can take it out of context and say, well, I'm not thinking about or reflecting the desires of the black community. But I think, lifted up the fact that this meeting was being held at 10 o'clock before anybody else said it. So I think I lifted up. I actually mentioned...
Technically, you said that to me yesterday when I saw you.
Okay, so before that.
Just said it.
Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
You said it.
Okay, thank you. So the same thing that you said, I'm saying those things, but again, it's context. And that's the only thing that I'm saying. So when you say not reflecting the black community or not having I live in Childs Park. We've created an initiative called Living in Childs Park. I get stopped. There's like a viral video of me and my interaction with the police. So I live that experience also, but I think the difference is the way that I'm able to demonstrate that and present that. I'm taking the approach of the chef, right? Because I understand that in order for us to have these, what I'm saying is,
I get up in my community and there's
right.
a home on the corner. That's ugly.
And I get that. I get that.
It's a very ugly ass thing when I come home and there are people building on my community, people right next to my home who pop up and cut down my trees and are coming in and don't say a thing. They have no remorse about pushing.
So let me say this, David, and this will be the last point that I'll say, David. I grew up in the neighborhoods where we had a lot of programs. And what would happen, the reason that I didn't take advantage of those programs is because let me say this to you.
Programs. We need economic development and reparations to the black community to restore what's been stolen from us. We don't need job training. We don't need financial literacy. We have that. We have to survive and feed ourselves and clothe and house ourselves all of our lives. It's offensive when y'all sit up there and say we need those kind of things.
What's offensive to me is the fact that you're not listening. Because what you just said was nowhere. That's offensive to me. That's offensive to me because I'm offended. But if you're not listening, that makes it that much more difficult, and it makes it more difficult for us to engage when you. Okay, thank you. So I'll stop there. This is what I was going to say. The reason I didn't take advantage of those programs was because the message was right, but the delivery was whack. And that's why I didn't take advantage of it. Now, you can think with that. The message is right, but the delivery is whack, and that's why a lot of people don't get it.
I'm not you.
Thank you.
I don't sit on city council.
Thank
I don't
you.
have to
Me either.
for anybody.
Let's talk after this. Let's talk after this. That's an invitation.
Sir,
for me to
thank you
have a
for
conversation.
waiting. Go ahead with your question.
Hello, well, first of all, my name is Gaius Hill. I am president of a small nonprofit, and also I have been in the real estate business for about 40 years. And I'm hearing a couple of things you're doing here. I have 2 daughters that live in St. Pete. One is a homeowner. One cannot afford to own a home. One can barely find a place to rent. So it's not a color issue. It is a moderate to low income housing issue. Okay, so that's my point of view. It is not a color issue. It is a income issue. Okay, so, having said that, the big fund, the Sadowski Fund, you probably have minimums that you can loan. The 4% income fund, I don't know about. Some states have a CITC, Community Investment Tax Credit Act, whereas banks are able to loan money at lower percent interest, and they get credit from the state for their franchise and excise tax. That seems to work very well because it grows the banks, creating more franchise and excise taxes for the state. It also helps low and moderate income. Just an idea to throw out there. Like to know more about the 4% income. The zoning issue, gosh, and the fact that everybody wants to group, quote, affordable housing together. Forget that. We need, what I don't see in St. Pete, I don't see 4-unit, 8-unit, 20 and 40-unit issues. I don't see that. It's been addressed this morning. I think that is your step in the right direction. I appreciate everybody's time this morning coming here because I want to understand this. How can I be any help in helping the community develop some of these things? I don't have a lot of money, so you could qualify me as an investor, but very small time. But I would like to help create housing that people can either own or rent in a moderate income. Moderate income, most places is classified as 80% of the median income. Not 80% of the highest, but 80% of the median. So I don't know what you classified here. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your answers. I'll contact people individually. But my big question is the 4% available, and is it enough for the small developments where you don't have to put a $3 million or a $5 million floor on the investment? We need investments, I think, that are $750,000, million, $2 million. Does the 4% cover that?
It really doesn't, mostly from a mathematical standpoint. And like I said before, the 4% tax credit has to be paired with state and local funds, and most of those, the state funds especially, are not available to those size of developments. And if you're a nonprofit, then there are some other opportunities.
But what about private funding for, like, from banks or anything? Is there any assistance that the community could pair with banks and private lenders to create some smaller loans? I think that is a big answer that I've seen in other areas to this problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Denise Deja. I'm with the New Deal for St. Pete Affordable Housing, and I'm also with the St. Pete Rent Control Coalition. First of all, Ben Diamond, I want to ask you, what was the name of the bill that you said was going through for the Sandowski?
Sure, it was House Bill 353. I can send you some more information on it or a copy.
Yeah, I would like that, if that's possible. And so my next question is with all of the restrictions that have been put down through Tallahassee with affordable housing and just housing issues in general, how are we going to, I mean, there's restricting municipalities tremendously on what they can do with affordable housing. How is it going to affect what you guys do on city council or what all of you do in your respective jobs to help us get over this problem? And then my next question is owning a house is great, and it's great for some people, but like myself, I'm on disability. I make $1,294 a month. I would love to own a house, but I don't, it's not, that's a scary thing for me. So I rent. And you have 19,000 people plus in St. Pete that rent and are on that verge of not always knowing whether they're going to be the next month out on the street. So I'm much more of a rent advocate because really there's more people out there that need to have housing, rental housing, and rental stability. So I'm always looking to talk about programs that we can put together for the rental community and hopefully maybe create some rules and regulations that can help to control landlords and how much they can ask for fees and move-in costs and how they treat renters when they evict them or make them move out. Those things are really important because if you're living low income or you're in a situation like me with limited income, I literally am like below paycheck to paycheck. So sometimes I go without food for the month. And that's because my rent is paid every month, but not everybody is like that. So, sometimes it doesn't work that way. And those people like me and others need the help that maybe some regulations or some rules or, I don't know, more housing, definitely, multi-unit housing would help.
Well, I heard a lot of, I think, kind of state issue questions because preemption does keep us from doing a lot of things that I think we would like to explore. So I'm going to pass it to either Senator or Representative and see what they have to say about this.
Well, first of all, you make good points. As a member of the legislature, a member of the Senate, when you're outnumbered 23 to 17, it's difficult to stop what we would consider to be bad policy for our neighborhoods and our communities. Sometimes the victory for us is in the debate. It's in the amendatory process where we try to make a bad bill better. Sometimes the amendments work, but we have to keep fighting for them, even when they don't work. So I accept your question and would answer it by saying, we'll keep fighting.
And I'll add to that. I mean, I think one of the takeaways for me from this morning is how challenging this issue is on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, and a city by city level, and a community by community level, which in my mind just reinforces the fact that when the state legislature rolls into town and says in Tallahassee, we're going to blanket preempt the ability for good people in local government like Carl Nurse or Randy Gabbard, Charlie Burtis, to experiment with the idea of, well, let's change our zoning in the CRA and let's do it in a way so that we have more duplexes and more places for people to live. I mean, why would we do that? Why would Tallahassee do that? I mean, these are issues that are hard issues as we've experienced in this conversation, and they're going to be solved in forums like this, in neighborhood meetings, in city council meetings. They're not going to be solved by Tallahassee directing or preempting a solution.
Joe?
I think, sorry, the kind of thing, first of all, at the very end, you mentioned we need more and more affordable housing. I think the first thing here is at the state level, not to pile on the state level, but the Sadowski Trust Fund also goes for development of multifamily housing rental. The sale part of it does that. That would help if we weren't sweeping as much of that money. But because you said, and you're right, that so much that the state does limits what to do, there's only a few things at the local level we can do. And as huge proponents of down payment assistance, it's small, but it's something to start with that we can do also is when it comes to renters, it's first and last month, assistance with that, paying of application fees. Those are things that local government can start doing. If we're talking about a down payment assistance fund for folks at the local level, we could also do that with renters as well.
Okay, that's good to know.
it's not a lot. I mean, it's not a huge thing, it's not the silver bullet, but I think also a lot of times we're all looking for the silver bullet, we're missing the low-hanging fruit.
Stay ready.
Thank you. All right, so out of respect for everyone's time, it is about 2 minutes till, so I'm going to take one last question and then make everyone a promise in the room, whether we agree or disagree to how we come to the solutions. The conversation is not over. So I respect all of your time for being here. I'll take one last question and then we're going to adjourn.
Hello, I'm Rick Davidson, new resident of the Edgemore neighborhood. I heard there was talk that the city might be funding some studies and down payments for limited equity cooperative housing. And I'd like to know where that stands. And then the second question or comment I have is that I did work with the city of Minneapolis and I'm familiar with one of the nation's largest CDFIs there, Community Reinvestment Fund of USA. They're working with the city of Detroit, the Ford and Kresge Foundations, and they're using a collaboration of city, county, state, and foundation money to fund projects. I'd like to know who I could talk to help bring that concept here.
Well, I'm not sure about your last question, but your first question regarding co-op housing, that is actually a conversation that we have started at the city. It started about mid-last year. We talked about co-op housing. We've now spread into talking about co-op businesses, co-op grocery stores. I want to give a huge shout out to Judith Turner because she really has led the way in bringing this to us. So what we decided to do is take all of those conversations and bring them into one. So we have another meeting this fall. It'll be a committee of the whole, and it will be surrounding co-ops in general. And so that is continuing to be on our radar moving forward. So thank you.
And anybody on the foundation concept?
Anybody else familiar with the second question? If he was.
I'm not sure if it's a direct answer, but something that occurred to me is the opportunity zones. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all. And you mentioned Kresge, and they're doing just incredible work building infrastructure around the opportunity zones incentive so that it actually benefits communities rather than just the investors. So I think that foundations locally, community foundations, private foundations, they really should be talking about how they can support opportunity zone equity investment in communities. I don't know if that helps.
We'll talk later, thanks.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, and I'm sorry to have to not really cut our time short, but just end our conversation today, but we will continue this. Please reach out to any of us individually, and I hope you all have a great day. Okay, yes, ma'am, actually, yeah, go ahead. You're welcome to stay. We have a lady here who missed class to be here with us today, and she has an important question, so we're going to give her the ability to do so. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Raquel Washington. I am a single mother of Jordan Park. I stay in Jordan Park, and I'm curious to know.
Please, if we could be respectful, please.
I'm curious to know when John Muhammad speaks about context, who are the parents or the children who are being relocated? Who are they supposed to report their blame to? Not their blame, but who are they supposed to hold responsible? You get what I'm saying? When they're being refinanced and stuff like that, as well as why is certain communities allowed to hide behind the process of zoning? When technically, when he spoke earlier, Scott McDonald, he said that zoning, we can't say, oh, we don't want this in our neighborhood, but we can say it's a zoning right issue. You get what I'm saying? So I don't understand, how can you hide behind that fact when you're, basically that's it. How can you hide behind that fact, and how can we not hold the context where it belongs?
So what I heard when Scott said that wasn't that he was defending and using that. What he was saying was, at this point in time, that probably is a legitimate argument, but that's why we need to change the zoning, so that it's no longer a legitimate argument. Is that correct?
Yeah, we need to take that tool away to encourage.
Right, we take the argument away, and then we can start to develop new multifamily homes and properties in corridors that make sense with transit-oriented developments.
So that was kind of what I heard from that. But John, if you want to address her first question?
So what I would say to that particular question is the fact that you left school or missed class to be here. I think that's important. And so the idea of organizing, my whole thing is what you just said, really speaking directly to people like you who have the lived experience, who have the passion that they're bringing, but they may not feel like their voices are welcome in the space. And so what my role has been was to work with people like you and others in the community to say, okay, share with me what it is that you're trying to say, and then allow me to come in, and then I can, because here's what happened, and I see, again, this is a broader conversation, and I'm not invalidating that, but what happens is, like I said, I don't know how, I'm gonna just say it like this, sometimes the message is right, but the delivery is whack. And that's a real thing when we're talking about communication and human relations. And so we want to be heard, but we're not speaking in a way that will allow people to hear us. And so what my role and contribution has been to say, I'm listening and I'm hearing you. And why she just said, I have told her what you said, but I didn't say it the way that you say it. And that's what we're working with. And that's the challenge we're finding with bringing lived experience populations to these conversations, is the fact that we bring so much passion to the process that people get uncomfortable with it, and not saying it is right or wrong, but it's a reality. And the way we deliver our message sometimes will allow our message to be unheard, even if it's the right message. And that's fine, we have that right. So what I would say is, like, I invited him to have a conversation with me afterwards. I invite you to have that conversation, and then we can really talk offline, because I don't want to get into a back and forth in public about what our positions is, because I think we have a lot more in common than we differ on, but the way that I articulate it is not the way that you would have said it, and so you don't think that I'm saying what you're saying.
I didn't say that, but what I do say is that we shouldn't sugarcoat the truth. If something needs to be heard and said the way it needs to be said, it needs to be said that way. We need to articulate it and speak it and deliver it the way it needs to be delivered, because otherwise they don't hear us when we speak it.
So here's what happens, though. When we do that, we get invalidated, because remember, we have a whole history of advocacy and a whole history of challenging oppression and a whole history of that. And the way that this whole society works is it's easy to label us, and you put people in boxes. So you can be the angry black man, or you can be the angry black woman, and then it allows people to be comfortable in their invalidation of what we're saying. And that's all that we have. So when we talk about strategy and the way we do it, I think there's a better approach to how we engage. And that's also debatable, because we had Malcolm X, we had, Marcus Garvey, we've had all of these advocates, but they never necessarily agreed on strategy, but they always understood what the objective was. And I think we need to have more of those conversations as a community, internally, as opposed to in forums like this. So again, I do invite you to a conversation.
And I hope that the next documentary, many of us watched When They See Us. We hope the next documentary is When They Don't Hear Us. So thank you for coming today.
And it's a real thing. That's absolutely a real thing.
Thank you.
You gonna be around? Because that's
All
for
right.
real.
Thank you to everyone who came today. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. I appreciate your time.
I'm here, right
and
here.
You all have a great day. Thank you.